One in every 200 men alive today is a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. This isn't just because he ruled a vast empire, it's the result of one of history's largest, systematic rape campaigns that forever altered the genetic makeup of Asia. In this documentary, we'll examine the brutal reality of how the Mongol armies weaponized sexual violence, how it was strategically implemented, and why modern historians often gloss over this disturbing aspect of the Mongol conquests. 1. The genetic legacy, DNA evidence of systematic rape. When geneticists first published their findings in 2003, even they were shocked by what they discovered. A single Y chromosomal lineage appears in approximately 8% of men across a vast region of Asia. That's about 16 million men today who share a common male ancestor. This genetic signature extends from northeast China to Uzbekistan, creating what scientists call a star cluster pattern in the DNA record. This pattern isn't what population geneticists typically see. Normal genetic spreading occurs gradually through migration, trade, or slow population movement. But this particular genetic signature exploded across Asia in a short time frame, starting roughly 1,000 years ago. The rapid expansion defied conventional explanations. Scientists initially puzzled over how one man's genetic lineage could spread so far and so fast. The mathematics didn't make sense until they overlaid the genetic map with the historical expansion of the Mongol Empire. The areas with the highest concentration of this genetic signature align almost perfectly with territories conquered by Genghis Khan and his immediate descendants. The timeline matches too. Using mutation rates as a genetic clock, researchers dated the common ancestor to approximately the late 12th or early 13th century, precisely when Genghis Khan rose to power. While we can't test Khan's DNA directly to confirm he was that ancestor, the geographic and temporal evidence points strongly in his direction. What's particularly telling is how this genetic legacy clusters in former Mongol territories. In some regions of Central Asia, nearly 1 in 4 men carry this signature. The highest concentrations appear along the routes of Mongol military campaigns, not along trading paths or migration routes. This isn't the signature of peaceful population movement, it's the genetic echo of conquest. Some historians romanticize Genghis Khan's many wives and concubines, suggesting his genetic legacy comes from high status and many willing partners. But the numbers tell a different story. Even if Khan personally fathered hundreds of children, which is biologically unlikely, that doesn't explain millions of descendants across thousands of miles within just a few generations. The mathematics only work with a systematic pattern of rape during conquest. Historical records support this. Chinese, Persian, and European accounts consistently describe Mongol armies capturing women in conquered territories. The genetic evidence transforms these written accounts from possible exaggerations into scientific fact. What we're seeing in the DNA record isn't just regular wartime sexual violence. The scale suggests something more systematic, something closer to a deliberate policy. If one genetic lineage accounts for 8% of men in a region today, the percentage of women raped during the actual conquest period would have been significantly higher. Population geneticists estimate that for this genetic pattern to emerge, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of women were sexually assaulted across Asia. This isn't just a historical footnote, it represents a demographic catastrophe that permanently altered the genetic landscape of an entire continent. The genetic legacy reveals something that written histories often understated. The true scale of sexual violence during the Mongol conquests far exceeded what most historical accounts acknowledged. Chronicles might describe the sacking of individual cities, but they couldn't capture the cumulative impact across all of Asia. This wasn't just military conquest through superior tactics or technology. The Mongol expansion represents a form of biological imperialism that rewrote the genetic code of populations across Asia. When we talk about Genghis Khan's legacy, we're not just discussing political boundaries or trade routes. We're talking about a permanent alteration of human genetics that persists to this day. The science confirms what survivors knew, but historians sometimes minimized. Sexual violence wasn't incidental to Mongol conquest. It was integral to it. And unlike buildings that can be rebuilt or treasures that can be replaced, This genetic legacy continues to echo through generations, a biological monument to systematic sexual violence on a scale previously unimaginable. 2. Tactical terror, sexual violence as military strategy. The genetic legacy paints a disturbing picture, but what's even more troubling is how deliberate it all was. Mongol armies weren't undisciplined hordes. They operated under strict military codes that would impress modern generals. Soldiers faced immediate execution for breaking formation in battle, abandoning positions, or even taking unauthorized plunder from conquered cities. This was, in many ways, one of history's most disciplined fighting forces, which makes what happened next all the more disturbing. These same strictly controlled armies systematically engaged in sexual violence with not just permission, but apparent direction from leadership. The historical contradiction is striking. Why would commanders who executed soldiers for minor infractions permit widespread rape? Persian chronicler Juvayni documented the process with clinical detachment. When Mongols captured a city, they separated women by age and appearance before methodically distributing them among officers and soldiers according to rank. The youngest and most attractive women were often sent back to Mongolia as slaves, while others became immediate victims of the conquering army. This wasn't random violence, it was organized. The strategic element becomes clearer when examining how the Mongols used the threat of sexual violence. Historical accounts from China and Persia describe Mongol envoys explicitly threatening cities with mass rape if they resisted. The message was simple and terrifying. Surrender immediately and some lives might be spared. Resist and face not just death, but complete destruction of your community through sexual violence. This pattern appears consistently across conquered territories. Cities that submitted without resistance sometimes escaped the worst atrocities. The Mongols often killed the ruling class and military leaders, but left civilians relatively unharmed. But cities that fought back faced something far worse: systematic rape that targeted every woman regardless of age or status, followed by mass execution. Take Nishapur in modern-day Iran. After the city resisted in 1221, Genghis Khan's son Tolui ordered that no male older than a boy should remain alive. But before the mass killings, soldiers were instructed to rape women in front of their families. This wasn't just violence, it was calculated psychological destruction of community bonds. The psychological warfare aspect was devastatingly effective. Sexual violence breaks community cohesion in ways that other violence doesn't. It creates lasting trauma that prevents communities from rebuilding social structures even if physical infrastructure remains. The Mongols understood this centuries before modern psychological research confirmed it. Perhaps most strategically valuable were the survivors. Women who escaped became unwitting psychological weapons, carrying stories of horror to neighboring regions. As these accounts spread, cities hundreds of miles from Mongol forces began surrendering without resistance. Records from Russian principalities show cities capitulating upon merely hearing rumors of Mongol approaches, having learned about the fate of those who resisted. This explains the apparent contradiction. Genghis Khan permitted sexual violence that would otherwise violate military discipline because it served clear strategic purposes: breaking enemy morale and encouraging preemptive surrender. This wasn't a failure of command control, it was a calculated military doctrine. The strategy worked with devastating effectiveness. The Mongol Empire expanded faster than any in history, eventually controlling approximately 24 million square kilometers, territories that would normally require far larger armies to conquer and control. Their fighting force rarely exceeded 150,000 men, yet they subjugated populations numbering in the tens of millions. The mathematics of conquest made sense only with psychological weapons that multiplied their effective force. Sexual violence served as that multiplier, creating terror disproportionate to the actual number of Mongol soldiers. Cities surrendered to relatively small forces because the alternative seemed worse than death. This calculated approach to sexual violence helps explain how the Mongols maintained control over vast territories with limited manpower. They didn't need to station large garrisons in every conquered city when the psychological scars of conquest kept populations submissive. What makes this history particularly disturbing isn't just the scale of sexual violence, it's how deliberately it was employed as military strategy. 3. The silenced history, cultural memory and historical erasure. Open a history book about Genghis Khan today, and you might read about his creation of the first international postal system, his meritocratic army promotion policies, or how the Pax Mongolica created safe trade routes across Asia. These achievements appear in documentaries, popular histories, and even school textbooks. But something crucial is often missing: the systematic sexual violence that was central to Mongol conquest strategy. This historical amnesia is relatively recent. If you had read accounts written by those who experienced the Mongol invasions firsthand, you'd encounter a very different narrative. Persian historian Ata Malik Juvaini wrote extensively about the violation of women as a standard Mongol practice. Chinese chronicles from the Jin and Song dynasties specifically catalogued sexual atrocities. Russian primary sources recorded that Mongol soldiers defiled wives and daughters before the eyes of their men, as standard procedure during conquests. These weren't just passing mentions. Contemporary historians from conquered regions developed specific terminology for Mongol sexual violence that distinguished it from typical wartime atrocities. Persian chroniclers used terms that specifically denoted the systematic nature of these assaults, indicating they recognized this wasn't ordinary wartime behavior, but something more organized and deliberate. The psychological impact was so severe that cultural memory of these events persisted for generations. In parts of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East, folk stories warned children of the Mongol terror for centuries after the empire collapsed. Russian folklore contains numerous references to the Tatar yoke, a period remembered primarily for sexual violence against women. These weren't just stories, but cultural trauma responses that shaped entire societies. So why do modern accounts so often sanitize this history? Part of it stems from how we conceptualize great historical figures. There's a tendency to separate military and administrative genius from moral character, creating narratives where brilliant leaders are simply men of their time regarding atrocities. This allows Genghis Khan to be reframed as a visionary state builder, rather than a perpetrator of mass sexual violence. Another factor is the scholarly focus on administrative systems rather than lived experiences. Modern historians often emphasize documentary evidence about taxation systems, military organization, and trade networks, all well documented in official records. The experiences of ordinary women rarely appear in these official histories, making their suffering easier to overlook. There's also what historians call source bias. Many Western accounts rely heavily on the writings of travelers like Marco Polo, who experienced the Mongol Empire during its stable period rather than during active conquests. These travelers often interacted primarily with Mongol elites rather than conquered populations, leading to more favorable accounts that emphasized order and administration rather than conquest methods. This selective history creates a fundamentally distorted understanding of how the Mongol Empire established and maintained control. The truth is that administrative innovations and trade networks weren't built on willing participation, but on populations traumatized into submission through systematic sexual violence. When we examine the erased history of Mongol sexual violence, we see how rape functioned as a deliberate strategy of terror, creating psychological trauma that made conquered populations easier to control. It wasn't incidental to conquest, it was central to it. The famous Pax Mongolica wasn't maintained just through efficient administration, but through the lasting psychological impact of sexual terrorism. By confronting this difficult history, we gain a more complete understanding of empire building throughout history. The Mongol Empire wasn't exceptional in using gendered violence as a control mechanism. It was just exceptionally effective at it. Similar patterns appear in colonization throughout history, from the Spanish conquest of the Americas to modern conflicts. The difference is primarily one of scale and systematic implementation. The real legacy of the Mongol conquests isn't just a postal system or religious tolerance, but a demonstration of how sexual violence functions as a tool of imperial control, a pattern that has repeated throughout history and continues in conflicts today. The Mongol Empire's legacy lives on, not just in history books, but in the very DNA of millions across Asia. When we strip away the sanitized version of history, we see empires built not through enlightened governance, but through systematic terror. The genetic record doesn't lie. It tells a story that written histories often minimize or erase completely. Understanding this aspect of history forces us to consider how power operates across time. Empire building has always relied on violence against women, though few examples match the scale and deliberate nature of the Mongol campaigns. If you want more untold histories that challenge conventional narratives, subscribe and join us next time.